Thank you very much, Inhi, and good morning to all of you. It's a lovely day, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I appreciate the invite, and I think the camp is a wonderful event that you guys are participating in. And I should say that kudos to Inhi and all the colleagues at KAIST for arranging this opportunity for the postgraduate students. I hope that you're going to have a lot of learning opportunities in this, and I'll try my best for this session to be as informative as possible for you guys. I come from University of New South Wales in Sydney, and my background, just like yourself, is in engineering and is in transport engineering. I'm a graduate of the University of Melbourne in transport engineering. However, people know me at UNSW Sydney as the human factors guy. The reason I ended up from being a purely modeling person, simulation only, numerical simulation and modeling and optimization to this area of research that I'm engaged in is that during my PhD time, I started taking all the courses in the School of Psychology of the University of Melbourne, one by one, until I think I had passed all of them, except by the end of my degree, the School of Psychology gave a big invoice to the School of Infrastructure Engineering, and I got told off by the head of the School of Infrastructure Engineering for costing the school that much money. Apparently, it was a lot of money. But anyway, I got away with it, and that has shaped my career into a person who tries to be the bridge between psychology and engineering. And you will see a reflection of that in the research that I do throughout the presentation today. So just a quick overview of the area of research that I am generally driving. Well, most prominently, I do research in the area of pedestrian crowd and evacuation dynamics, or if you call it crowd safety, and this is the area I'm going to be talking about today with you. I do both experimental research and numerical modeling research in this area, and I will be talking about both aspects today for you. But I also take interest in research in the area of active transport and micromobility, especially the safety of e-scooter riders, pedestrians in shared environments. I do research that has implications in urban planning, for example, how pedestrians perceive safety and security in urban walkways, and how you can model and quantify this perception and translate it into a digital twin platform where you can see the perception of people across an entire metropolitan area based on some econometric models. I do research in the domain of road safety, mostly behavioral research in that aspect. Things such as driver distraction and topics around that are of my interest. My apologies. And also in the area of disaster resilience, I do both behavioral research, how do people react to cases of natural disasters, and also optimization modeling research, how we can optimize the rescue and evacuation planning of cities from the perspective of disaster management services. So both aspects are of my interest in this domain. But for the purpose of today's lectures, I'm only going to focus on pedestrian crowd and evacuation dynamics. I'm going to present to you the research that I've been undertaking over the last 10 years or so. None of the things that I am presenting is the work of any students. This is the area where I have never engaged any students, so everything is the work by myself. And it's the overall outcome of a decade of research that I have been doing in this area. At UNSW, I also teach a course on human factors in civil and transport engineering, which is a comprehensive, relatively comprehensive course in human factors in transportation and road safety, human factors in built environment, and also human factors in construction. It started from a course in transportation only, and it was welcomed quite immensely by the students. All of a sudden, we have in our school, our electives get an enrollment of 20, 25, maximum 30. On the first enrollment, we had 65 students, And then on the second year, we had 85, 95, and now we have 120 students. And as such, the school has asked me to incorporate aspects of human factors from all across civil engineering in this course, given the interest that the students have shown in this program. And I teach some courses, short courses for industry professionals, one in road safety and one in crowd safety. Okay, getting to the main point. We are going to be talking about crowd safety today. One of the most prominent features of urban resilience is our ability to keep people safe in areas where a large number of people congregate. This includes busy train stations, stadiums, mass gatherings, concerts, and any other area where there is a high concentration of humans on foot, what we call pedestrians. And in order to keep people safe, we need to recognize the type of risk that people are facing, the nature of risk that the crowd might be facing, what can threaten their safety, could be in two categories. I find this categorization quite useful, into intrinsic risk and extrinsic risk. There are sources of risk to crowd safety that are not related to any external factor. It's because of the nature of the behavior of the crowd itself. Things such as overcrowding, pushing, crowd crushes, stampede, or crowd violence are this nature. Extrinsic risks, however, are the type of dangers to crowd safety that would come from outside the crowd. Things such as environmental hazards, such as a heat wave, what happened in Mecca, for example, a couple of days ago, resulting in the death of more than 1,300 people. Or at the Taylor Swift concert in Brazil last year, resulting in the death of a fan during the show. Extreme weather, fire, and terror attacks. So as we know, entities and bodies that would want to harm a society would find crowded spaces a very vulnerable and good target, in that they can cause a lot of damage at minimal cost. Given the fact that there is a high concentration of people in these kind of environments, it makes it very attractive target for people who want to cause harm and level violence at the society. So when we talk about crowd safety, we are talking about protecting crowds from all sources of risk. A comprehensive crowd safety management program would take into account all these aspects. But how are crowd safety risks materializing around the world? By the way, before I continue, I have not put the screenshot of any papers here, just because the screenshots would have dominated the lecture material, and I just didn't want you to get distracted by the name of the journal, name of the authors, etc., etc. But if you are interested in any aspects of this, please feel free to contact me, and I will direct you to the specific paper of mine that I am drawing this material from. A couple of years ago, with my colleague Claudio Feliciani from University of Tokyo, we started developing a database. We were worried and curious to see how crowd accidents have distributed across time and across geographical region. The issue was that there was no comprehensive database that would have documented all these accidents. So what we had to do was a very long journey of going through news media reports from 1900 all the way to 2019 and try to identify every crowd accident that has happened and reported in news media at some point in time. We did so, and we identified something around 260 crowd accidents since 1900 all the way to 2019. This does not include terror attacks against crowds or things that are happening as external factors to the crowd. It only includes what we call crowd crushes and crowd stampede, or internal crowd accidents. As to the distribution, some of the interesting observations that we have is that there is not a uniform distribution of these accidents. There are two particular hotspots for these accidents. One is in India, and the other one is in the west of Africa. These are the two hotspots for deadly crowd accidents. And all of the things that I'm showing are the ones that have resulted in death. And the significance of the accident is proportional to the size of this bubble and circle that you see, the number of people who have died in these accidents. And in terms of the distribution over time, you see that in Europe we have had certain accidents, deadly ones as well, but they are the old ones. The recent accidents are all happening in specific parts of the world that I am showing you. India, some in Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia, who is notorious for these kind of accidents. Thousands upon thousands of people have died over the years, and west of Africa. In terms of the type of the accidents, and the numbers are going up. The numbers are not slowing down. The number of accidents, the number of deaths, the number of injuries, they are all on the rise. In terms of the nature of the events, where these crowd accidents, these deadly crowd accidents have occurred, there is a very interesting and telling pattern. If you look at the data from 1980s and 1990s, you will see that these accidents, these fatalities were predominantly happening in sport events. These are usually the accidents that you see across Europe, but not exclusively in Europe. But over the years, the occurrence of these accidents have shifted from predominantly in sport events to very predominantly in religious gatherings. Rarely is it the case that nowadays these crowd accidents happen in the sport events, whereas religious mass gatherings are the ones that are at highest risk of crowd accidents. Our effort in protecting crowds from these types of risk has resulted in the formation of a field that we now refer to as crowd dynamics. I don't particularly like the term crowd dynamics to define this field, just because of the fact that it's quite vague and generic. I think the field of crowd safety would have been a better description of this field, but just because many people go with this terminology, I'm going with the flow as well. But if you look at my writing, I usually refer to this field myself as the crowd safety field. And many people from across different disciplines are involved in it. In a paper in 2020, I don't know, I'm not sure, I quantified the contribution of all the different disciplines to the formation of the field of crowd dynamics. To my surprise, it turned out that the majority of contributions are actually coming from electrical engineering and computer science people. And then it is followed by contributions from people who have background in physics, and then safety and fire sciences, and then at the least transportation researchers. There is a small cohort of people in the psychology domain that are involved in this, but in the grand scheme of things, their contribution was so small that it did not show necessarily in this visualization. But there are some psychologists that are involved in the field of crowd dynamics as well. I'm going to take you back to almost a decade ago, where I started this area of research for myself. I want you to know what was happening back then and the paradigm shift that has occurred over the last decade in this area of research in terms of thinking and methodologies and how we go about crowd research. The modern crowd research versus the crowd research about a decade ago. And what motivated me, basically, to get engaged in this area of research, what I observed in terms of knowledge gaps, what was really concerning in terms of the methodologies that we were using. A decade ago, the big deal in crowd dynamics was modeling. Everybody wanted to develop a good, accurate simulation model. This was not just academics. Many tech companies were also involved in the development of simulation models. As a result, we have now multiple commercial packages that can simulate the movement and the motion of pedestrian crowds. And also researchers were involved in that area as well. But unfortunately, there were four main paradigms of thinking in doing crowd research and modeling. One was claiming that, well, we have micro-simulation models of vehicular traffic, right? We know about fundamentals of vehicular traffic flow characteristics. We know about it, for example, the notion of fundamental diagram and all those things. We can just scale them down and translate those models into models of pedestrians. All we need to do is just to change the icons in the visualization and some little tweaks here and there. I really objected that because, as I will show you, to the best of my ability given the time limit, the movement and traffic flow of pedestrians is by no means similar to the movement and traffic flow of cars and vehicles. For example, cars and vehicles, this is just one point. Cars and vehicles are not meant to bump into each other. Pedestrians bump into each other all the time and no major thing happens, right? They can change their body orientation when they go through a bottleneck. Whereas when cars go through a bottleneck, they have to stick to their lanes. They cannot change their orientation that much. They have to be within the lanes. There are many, many fundamental characteristics that would make the traffic flow of pedestrians uniquely different from that of vehicular traffic. As such, I really do not see any potential for applications of traffic flow, vehicular traffic flow models for pedestrian traffic modeling. There was another group of people who loved to model the motion of crowds like fluids, bodies of fluids. They say, well, when we look at the movement of crowds, it just looks like the movement of bodies of water and fluid. And we know much about the movement of bodies of fluid because the field of fluid mechanics is a very, very well-established field, and the physical principles of fluid mechanics have been already figured out in terms of a number of fundamental equations, and those are not debatable. So what we can do is that we can make an analogy between the movement of crowds and the movement of fluids and modify those equations in such a way that they represent the movement of crowds. That is not on. The thing is that just because the movement of crowd on the surface looks a little like the movement of fluid, especially if the crowd is very dense, does not justify this kind of analogy. Yes, if we did not have any technical and computational capabilities to model the movement of crowds in an agent-based format, yes, you would have resorted to an analogical approach like this. But nowadays we have capabilities in modeling pedestrians in agent-based settings. So when we get these capabilities, in my view, these things have to go out of the window. We should not go back a decade ago to what we used to do just because we did not have capabilities of agent-based modeling. Still, I see papers coming out and saying that, oh, this is another fluid type model of pedestrian motion that I am proposing. And it's good because when we are talking about a big crowd and a dense crowd, computational capabilities could be an obstacle, and my model can overcome that. That is not necessarily the case. We can simulate the movement of 500,000 pedestrians in a venue, for example, using agent-based models and parallel processing and GPU processing these days. So I don't see any computational restriction on our agent-based models. As such, these kind of things, I think, should go away, and nobody should work on them anymore. There was another approach, likening the movement of pedestrians to granular matter, like the movement of grains in silos. Yes, on the surface it looks alike, but also the movement of grains in the silos are governed purely by the principles of physics. These grains, these particles, they do not have any will and decision-making capabilities of their own. They are governed by the rules of physics and physics only. Whereas pedestrians are not the same. Pedestrians have the will of their own. They can make decisions, make their movement the way they want to, and these things cannot capture those level of nuance and details. And of course, a group of people used to learn from the movement of herds of animals and flocks of birds, etc., and translate them into the movement of pedestrians. Again, I do not see any reason we should do this, because we have now the capabilities of learning from the movement of actual pedestrians. In that case, there is no need to use these kind of analogies. But when it comes to modeling of pedestrians, there is one aspect that has been a big hindrance for us. They said that, well, we do macroscopic modeling, we use data from the observations of the herds of sheep, for example. We use granular flow principles. just because we don't have enough pedestrian data and crowd data to develop models. And my thing was that, well, yes, that may as well be true, but why are we so lazy? If we don't have enough data, then generate the data. You should initiate it. You should generate the data. Well, how do we generate the data? Should we go to the field and observe crowds and pedestrians in the field? Because at the time there were no other options. I will get to that. And some of these challenges involving in the development of pedestrian simulation tools and models can be all resolved by the provision of enough explanatory data. The complexity of human behavior, yes, if we have enough data, we can understand the complexity of human behavior. The heterogeneity of individuals' behavior. Not everybody behaves the same in the crowd. But yes, that heterogeneity can also be understood if we have enough data. The fact that we are talking about movement of people in a continuous space, for example, in contrast with the movement of vehicles in roads that are not necessarily in continuous space. Vehicles have to be driving within certain lanes, whereas pedestrians can be anywhere on the spaces that accommodate them. The variety of geometric designs that we need to take into consideration. When we are talking about models of traffic flow, all cities and all transport networks are by and large similar in that they have the structure of nodes and links and the streets with a number of lanes, etc., etc. But when we are talking about pedestrian models, the model that you develop should be good for the structure of a stadium. It should also be good for the structure of an open space crowd. It should be good for the structure of a building setting. There are a huge range of type of infrastructure that you need to take into consideration when developing your models. Whereas the infrastructure of a road network is by and large the same across all different cities in the world. Yes, the shape of the network is different, but you know what type of infrastructure and input in terms of entities into the model you are dealing with. Regardless of that, all these things can be done if we had enough data. So my argument was that, sure, we don't have enough data, we should generate that. For example, how do we know the legal level of blood alcohol level for driving? Did we go and ask drunk drivers to tell us how they feel and how much alcohol they have consumed? No, we created a controlled situation. A lot of people did that around the world in 1990s, for example, and brought people into their laboratories with some basic driving simulator laboratories of the time in 1990s. They gave some people an alcoholic drink, they gave some other people placebo drink, and then they increased the concentration of alcohol, and then they realized that, well, we see that at this level of concentration, 0.05, the performance of the driver really degrades. And we are deciding that this should be the limit, the legal limit. So we did not have the data, but we created it. Yes, we created it in a relatively artificial environment, but that relatively artificial environment was not too far from reality. People still had to drive in some form of shape, but it gave us the capability to investigate this matter in a controlled setting while having control over the variable of interest, which was the concentration of alcohol in the body of the driver. This is just one of the examples in science, across science, where we need data, but that data does not exist in the real world. We have to create it ourselves. So questions were, yes, crowd things happening in the real world, in real settings like this. Can we just go out there and observe these kind of things and learn crowd behavior in these kind of settings? This is a stadium in Sydney, a footy game, Australian football game that I have attended. A very famous player, Bobby Franklin, scored his 1,000th goal, and everybody decided that they wanted to celebrate that goal with him, and they joined the pitch. And if you're wondering whether I also ran into the pitch as well, yes, once I finished filming, I also joined them in congratulating Bobby Franklin. Also, these kind of settings. This is one of the Taylor Swift concerts in Melbourne that I was attending as crowd safety advisor to make observations and make recommendations to the stadium that held this concert. This is so far the biggest concert that Taylor Swift has held, with 95,000 attendees. And we could see the risks that were happening to crowds. For example, they had so many different exits all across the pitch, but everybody had figured out that Taylor is going to exit while you're there. So the entire crowd actually congregated around 2-3 of the exits, where all other exits were available. That prolonged the process of the departure of the crowd quite significantly. And when they got out, they also faced this kind of situation that was quite close to a crowd crush. Fortunately, there was good communication between security, and we made some changes to the environment. We invited some people back in, and that resulted in the conflict between two flows that had met each other head-on. Quite a scary situation. Don't say that I was but fortunately, there's no action was taken to prevent the potential deadly war as well as that's the analysis of the Taylor Swift concert. That I handed to the stadium. It's a long document, and they are implementing some of those strategies for the future events where the stadium is at capacity. I think I should not be walking I should limit my range for the purpose of the recording. But in 2015, I proposed this new approach in crowd research. I claimed that, well, if we have driving simulator laboratories as a well-established methodology of understanding driver behavior, we should have crowd research laboratories as well. And I created these kind of experimentations that have now become a very established method in crowd safety research, where I create a situation that is not perfectly the real world setting. It is still a little artificial, but it creates an environment where people in a crowd can interact with one another. For example, a situation that can simulate the process of an evacuation in a fairly realistic way, but also in a way that would allow me to make observations with great levels of accuracy from these people, and also repeat things and make any changes to the environment that I want, in the direction that I want, and study the factor of interest by changing certain variables in the environment. So it gives me control over the variables of interest, the design factors, and it gives me the ability to measure everything with great levels of accuracy. Okay? And I thought this could be a compromise between Buddy Franklin crowd and no data. So we have a situation where we have no data and we use fluid mechanics equations for crowds, and we have a situation where we have perfect field crowd, except it's not ready for modeling purposes. Why is it that the situation like the Buddy Franklin crowd or Taylor Swift crowd is not necessarily good for modeling? Well, first of all, I cannot measure everything in that environment perfectly. There is a limited capability in terms of the measurements. If you see my report for the MCG Stadium, I expressed to them that everything that I am proposing to you is to the best of my measurement capabilities on the day, because I did not have any setting to make measurements at a high level of accuracy, because it's a field environment. That is not a laboratory environment like this where I am in charge of everything and I can measure everything. Secondly, what happened at the end of the concert is a one-off. Only happened once. This is not the case that I can say to the crowd that, okay guys, now can you come back and do this situation one more time under this condition, see what happens. This is not something that I can do. It was a one-off observation, and usually one-off observations are not good for the purpose of modeling. So this is the argument that I presented to you. So I advocated 10 years ago, one, for the development of crowd and pedestrian models in agent-based frameworks, meaning that we should move away from fluid mechanic models and we should try to simulate the behavior of every single entity of our system. The entities of our system in this case are pedestrians. So if we are modeling the movement of a system composed of pedestrians, it is our job as the modeler to simulate the behavior of every single entity. But what does it mean to simulate the behavior of every single entity? People show a range of behavior when in crowded situations. Take the situation of an evacuation, for example. Every single agent throughout the process of an evacuation makes a range of decisions. Decisions about the speed that they take, decisions about the direction they go to, the global navigation, the smaller scale navigation, and they have the ability to change those decisions as well. Is it possible to simulate all those things for every single agent? That seems like quite a bit to ask. But that is true, but if you want to simulate the process accurately, this is what it takes. This is what agent-based simulation means. And we have done that for traffic flow of vehicles. Our traffic flow simulation models, they also have different modules for different types of decisions that drivers make. For example, we have a module for car following. We have a module for navigation and route choice, for example. And when they join one another, they can simulate the movement of vehicles and the performance of a network across the entirety of that network. And I just use the same principle. I differentiated between strategic levels of decision making for crowds, tactical levels of decision making, and operational levels of decision making. Do pedestrians necessarily think of a strategic, tactical, and operational when they are making the decisions? Not necessarily. They make these decisions subconsciously. But the fact is that this type of categorization allows me, as the modeler, to be able to better differentiate between different aspects of their behavior and better formulate them. And most layers of this model, whose structure I am presenting to you, are different types of econometric models. You see, for example, duration models, multinomial logit model, a binary logit model, except for the operational level, which are physics models mostly. Okay? I'm going to take you through different aspects of this model. It's easy to formulate the model on a paper, and it's easy to come up with the type of model that you would use, but at the end of the day, there will be one question that would hit you. Every layer of modeling that you define, if you define it good, it will have some parameters. How do we specify those parameters? You used to see papers in crowd dynamics proposing agent-based models, very sophisticated equations with all the Greek letters and all of that, lots of parameters. And when it comes to the application, the author would be, okay, now let's apply this model to this kind of scenario. And when it comes to the parameters, I think these are the good values for parameters. Theta equals 1, beta equals 2.5, gamma equals 3. And when you ask why, I just think these are the best parameters. Can you give any evidence for that? No, we don't have any data. That is the type of paradigm that I've been trying to go against. These parameters, this structure of modeling that I'm presenting to you can work as a beautiful model, very accurate, provided that I specify these parameters nicely. This various structure of model can work like a rubbish model with no bearing on reality, no reliable output, if I misspecify only few of these parameters. So I would argue that the performance of a model at the end would not depend on the structure of the model as much as it depends on the values of these parameters. And these experiments that I showed you are all meant to provide well-informed, empirically calibrated values for these parameters that I am showing you. The philosophy of the experiments that I show you is that I isolate one layer of the model. I say, for example, now I am interested in exit choice aspect of people's behavior. Then I design a specific set of experiments for exit choice. I generate data. I show you how to generate the data from it. and then I feed that data into a multinomial logit model, I get the values of the parameters. Then my parameters are based in empirical information, as opposed to me just thinking that these parameters are good. There is no researcher out there in the world whose intuition is good enough to specify these parameters based on their own brain. Our brain is not developed to do such a thing. We need data, we need to feed data to our model and expect the parameters to come at the end. And then I do another set of experiments for exit choice changing, and I calibrate the values of these parameters. And I do the same thing for all layers of the model, and at the end of the 10 years, you will see that I have a model that is fully calibrated. Yes, it takes 5, 6, 7 years to do such a thing, but that's the nature of research. Let's take one of the layers of the model, exit choice. This is one of the decisions that a person needs to make in a crowded situation, no matter if they are in an evacuation scenario or not an evacuation scenario and a normal operation. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just think of an evacuation scenario for the sake of the discussion. When you're talking about an agent-based model, your responsibility as the modeler is to generate every required decision at every point in time for every single agent that you have in the system. Let's focus on this particular agent in the system at this particular moment in time. This agent has just stepped into this environment. Now, as the modeler, in order to keep the process of simulation going, you need to simulate this particular decision. And that is the choice between this exit and that exit. And that is not an obvious choice that we are facing. The agent is facing an exit that is a little bit further here compared to exit number 2, but it's more crowded. There is a bigger queue at this exit. There is almost no queue at this exit. This exit is visible to this agent, so there is no element of ambiguity about it, but this exit is invisible to the agent. There is an element of ambiguity. And there is a small group of people that are moving towards this exit number 1. There is a bigger group of people that are moving towards exit number 2. How does this agent make a trade-off between these attributes and make a decision? Well, it's easy to put all these attributes in a utility model, in an econometric model, and have a nicely written model on the paper. This is what I have just done here. Okay, all these attributes that I have mentioned, I would claim that would give exit number 1 a certain level of utility based on the combination of these factors, and would give exit number 2 a certain level of utility based on the combination of these factors. If you have the utility value of exit number 1 and exit number 2, then you can calculate these utilities, put everything in a logit model, and the outcome would be the probability of the agent choosing exit number 1 versus the probability of the agent choosing exit number 2. Okay? Sounds easy on the paper. Then what is the problem here? What is it that we don't know? So,
it won't change.
What's that? Can you say again?
You'll automatically choose exit 1. It won't change.
No, but for this calculation, is there anything that is prohibiting us from doing this calculation? We have the distance, we have the congestion, we have the visibility and the flow and everything. So in terms of variables, we are set, right? But there is something that we don't have. What are they? Do we know the parameters? We don't know the parameters. If we knew the parameters, things would have been easy. If I know what value represents people's perception of distance, or the relative contribution of this attribute on the person's decision making, and also beta 2, beta 3, beta 4, and beta 5, then it's easy for me to calculate this utility for exit number 1 and for exit number 2, and then put it into a logit model and calculate the probabilities. That is a relatively easy programming process, right? But I don't know these parameters. That's the issue. And in my view, nobody should take it upon themselves to specify these parameters based on their own understanding. I think this should be -1, and beta 2 should be -2, etc., etc. Nobody knows unless you get the data. How do you get the data? This way. So you create a situation where a crowd of 150 people perform these evacuation tasks involving exit choice. The area of interest in this case is exit choice. And you have them repeat and repeat and repeat for 20 times, 25 times. That generates a lot of repetitions, right? That's the first step towards generating the data that is required to calibrate this model. Remember, from now until I tell you, our purpose is just to calibrate these 5 parameters for this very model that I am presenting to you here, okay? So you do these experiments. That is still not data. That is interesting footage that you show to people. That is not data, is it? It's not numbers. I don't see any numbers in it. Still don't see any numbers. Just showing you the type of variations that you can make to the environment in order to increase maximum variability in the type of observations that you generate. And then the next step would be doing some image processing. You do some image processing, and then you extract the trajectories of people. You know who was where at any point in time. Still one step closer to data. But having the information about who was where is not necessarily choice data. What I need is decision data, choice data, because my model was choice data, wasn't it? So we get one step closer to generating the data. And this identification of the trajectories is a good step. But the main step and the painful step is this one, where you have to attend. This is the protocol that I propose. It's very painful to do for this kind of this kind of data extraction, but this is the best way I know. For every single individual, in every one of these scenarios, you focus on one single person, okay? And you need to repeat this procedure for every single person. And we are talking about 3,500 people, because if 150 people repeated the scenario, these experiments 20 times, then we are talking about 3,000 or 3,500 individuals altogether, right? So you focus on one person. You play the scene in a slow motion while visualizing the trajectory of the person. That is a good guide. I know that the person is going to exit through exit number 2. What I don't know is that at what point in time did they make their decision? This is what I don't know. So I look at the scene and I use 3 visual indicators. The sizes of the steps that they are taking, their body orientation, and their head movement, as well as the shape of the trajectory. Usually at the point of decision making, the trajectory stabilizes, they stop looking around, and they take bigger steps towards their destination. And at that moment, once I identify the decision moment, and once you do it a couple of times, 20, 30 times, you get the hang of it. It's relatively straightforward to determine the point of decision making with good accuracy. And you can also train other people to help you with that. Okay? At this moment, I freeze the scene and I record all the attributes of interest that I showed you earlier. What were the attributes or variables of interest? Well, for a choice observation, you need these components. First of all, you need to know the choice set. How many options did this person have at this moment, assuming that they made the decision at this point in time? How many options did they have? 4 options. Exit number 1, 2, 3, 4. So I know the choice set. Which option did they choose? They chose exit number 2. So I know the choice they made. And what are the attributes of every option? I can calculate. This is the level of congestion at the alternative number 1. This is the level of congestion at alternative number 2, 3, and 4. The distance to alternative number 1, 2, 3, and 4, I can calculate. The condition of visibility at alternative 1 and 2, visible at alternative 3 and 4, invisible, I know that too. The size of flow that is moving towards each alternative, that I can calculate too. All of that together, the choice set, the choice made, and the attribute levels, that would be 1 point of observation. Now we can let this person go and go to the next person and repeat the same procedure. And then let that go and go to the next person and repeat the same procedure. Don't worry, I'm not going to repeat that 3,000 times. This is the last one, the third one. But if you repeat that for all the individuals, I can play a video from another experiment that is not what I'm exactly showing you, but the protocol is by and large the same. So if you look at the process of data extraction for this particular individual, the focus is on this one. Okay, this is the subject of interest. And based on the shape of the trajectory, I expect decision making around this point. The subject enters the scene. They are exploring the environment. They are undecided. They are looking around. But at this point, roughly, they make up their mind. This is where you freeze the scene and you start calculating variables of interest, including distance, congestion, visibility, flow, and everything that is in your model. You repeat that, and you get a data set of a couple of thousands of observations. Each of these blocks that I'm showing you is associated with one person in one of those experimental trials, okay? So that's, now this is data, isn't it? We went from the footage, pure raw footage, to something that includes decision-making data. Now this data can be fed into a maximum log likelihood estimation process, right? Remember the model? You feed that into your model, and the outcome of that, after doing the optimization procedure, would be the level of parameters that you are looking for. These are the parameters. These are the parameters. Remember, I went from having no idea about beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, beta 4, and beta 5 to having some values that are not based on my own thinking, rather based on information obtained from empirical data. Now you can feed that into your model. Now it's a calibrated model, empirically calibrated model. It's a painful process that took multiple years to do. Just for this particular layer of modeling, it took more than 2.5 years to get these 5 values. But this is how you do it correctly. No other way would result in any accurate estimation of these parameters. I would have done an exercise today, but I don't think we have time for that. So I'm going to skip over it. Once you have, the point was that the procedure of calibrating the model is painful. But once you have it, application and implementation is not painful. It's very easy in terms of programming. It's very easy. It's something you can do in Excel as well. For example, I'm showing you a situation here with the same person, right? I'm giving you the attribute levels, right? The congestion, the distances, and everything. And I'm asking you that given the model, calculate the probability that this person chooses exit number 1, or number 2, or number 3, or number 4. This could be a moment in simulation as well, right? And that's very easy. It can be done in a quick back of the envelope Excel exercise. You have the parameters, you have the alternatives and their variables. So all you need to do for calculation of utilities, you say parameter times variable plus parameter times variable plus parameter times variable all the way, and that would be the utility. And then you go exponential function of the utility, and you calculate that for all the alternatives, and the summation of that, and then the probabilities based on logit model. You get 34% for alternative number 1, 42% for alternative number 2, 13% for alternative number 3, and 9% chance for alternative number 4. In this case, the highest probability is actually going to the alternative that the person has chosen, which is good. This is an indication of a good model. It's kind of a validation process for your model. But if I didn't know these parameters, or if I change the value of these parameters slightly, then these probabilities can significantly change, meaning that if I had misspecified any of these parameters, I would have made vastly different predictions for this very given situation. Okay? But this is very difficult to do. Do the experiments, spend at least 1.5 years of data extraction, etc., all so that you can have those 5 from. Is there an easier way of doing this? Well, in this case, there was. In fact, before I did those experiments, I ran a very simple survey. The structure of the experiment that I showed you is the smaller scale of an actual building in a university in Melbourne, right? It was inspired by a building. This is the floor plan of that building. In he knows, Robert Menzies building. This is the floor plan of that building. So a year before I did those experiments in the basketball court, I ran a stated preference survey. I'm sure that you being the transportation researchers, you know about the stated preferences. But basically what I did is that I created moments of decision making for people in hypothetical images. And I went to that building, intercepted pedestrians who came out, and I said, $5 for your time if you answer these 14 questions. And then I showed them these hypothetical scenarios and said, what if there is an evacuation emergency here? What would you do? Which exit do you choose? And they stated the choice. And if you do that for a couple of hundred people, considering that every person responds to 14 scenarios, then you have a couple of thousands of observations. And each of these observations are kind of equivalent to one of these observations, isn't it? In terms of the structure. It's just coming from a very different type of data generation methodology, from people being in a crowd and making decision making to people not being in that crowd and just being shown the picture and stating their choices. So this is the difference between revealed choices versus stated choices. But what would happen if I take this data set and estimate those 5 parameters? What would I get? I get these values. I get these values. Are these values similar to the values you got? That's the obvious question you're asking, right? You got from the experiments. Let's go back. I showed you briefly. Not sure if you noticed. Yes, very much so. These are the values I got from this experiment, and these are the values I got from that experiment. And if you're worried about how they predict, how differently they predict, remember I calculated the probabilities for one example using this model. Now I'm going to calculate the probabilities for the same example using this model coming from this data set. This would be the calculation. Let me show you if I have it here. This is the calculation. So the same thing, the variable levels are the same. The only thing that has changed is, you need to be able to answer this. Between these two, the only thing that has changed in terms of the input into the model is coefficients. In the above example, the coefficients were coming from the basketball court experiments data. In the below, they are coming from the stated preference data. How different is the prediction? It's actually not very different. 34, 30%, 42%, 45%, and this and that. There is a great consistency between the outcomes of this model versus this model. So yes, in this particular case, there was a cheaper way of doing the data. The conclusion of that is that instead of having no data, doing fluid types things that have nothing to do with pedestrians, try to have some observational data about pedestrians. That works better than my own thinking and my own analogies from fluid mechanics and granular flow, etc., etc. You can make some preliminary data, some basic forms of data, but at least you know something about the behavior of pedestrians. And I really warn about against specifying those parameters with zero data. Zero data is what we should not be doing at all. Based on my own understanding, as if it doesn't matter if I'm a professor or a novice modeler, doesn't matter. I just cannot have the intuition to know how these values should be specified. And that's the only thing that that's the only way that I can do it is through data. So this is the comparison of the simulation results of this data set versus that. I just skipped through it, given that I showed you already. So this same paradigm of doing experiments, calibrating a specific layer of the model, I have replicated it using various types of experimentation. Each experiment is focused on certain aspects of pedestrians' behavior. Sometimes I am focused on exit choice behavior of pedestrians. Sometimes I am focused on how they change their decision. If my intention is to understand and model the decision changing aspect of pedestrians, then I design a whole different type of experiment with that in mind, optimized for that aspect of behavior. Because this experiment that was designed was optimized in design for exit choice change observations. Sorry, exit choice making observations. If you want exit choice changes, then you have to design another experiment with that element in mind and optimize the design for that aspect. The design of these experiments, it requires its own philosophy. It's kind of my own thing, and I have written extensively about how you can design these experiments, but very few people have so far adopted it just because it's very painful. I'm not saying that people do not do crowd experiments, but they do not design crowd experiments for individual level analysis of decision making, because that's where the difference is between data generation within 2 months compared to data generation within 2 years. As soon as you aim to generate data of decision making at the level of individuals, your data generation procedure goes from a few months to a couple of years. And that is not the amount of time every researcher is willing to spend on a project. Go. So physical aspects of behavior, behavior of people at bottlenecks. Every experiment corresponds with one of the layers of the model that I showed you earlier. This. Every one of these experiments corresponds with one of these layers of modeling. And as a result, over the years, over the decade that I mentioned, doing this kind of experimentation, I have had a good understanding of how these parameters should be specified based on empirical data. For example, another layer of the model is exit choice changing. Okay? When people make exit choice, for example, when they enter an environment, they can also change that decision, right? From the perspective of modeling, I have two approaches. I can say, well, how often is it that people change their decisions? Okay? It's not very often. Only a small portion of people change their decision. This is a genuine question that I had in mind. So for the purpose of modeling, wouldn't it be enough if I just generate a single decision for every agent and just let it go and don't give them the opportunity to change decisions? That is one approach of modeling, right? I actually thought that would be acceptable until I added and calibrated a component of exit choice changing to the model and then observed the massive difference that it makes in terms of the accuracy of the predictions. I realized that without having this layer, no matter how much I try to make this layer perfect, it just doesn't go above a certain level of accuracy. So I designed an experiment for exit choice changing, not this one, and a dedicated experiment for exit choice changing, and I formulated an exit choice changing model as well, for example. What variables does that have? Well, the exit choice changing model takes into consideration this agent is at this exit. Is there any alternative that is performing better than the current exit? Takes that into consideration as a variable, takes the visibility of that potential other alternative into consideration, takes social influence into consideration, given the fact that in my observations, when one person changes decision, it instigates a couple of other decision changing as well. So one person changing decision usually instigates a few more people following that behavior that they showed. So I call it the social influence. So in the model, from the perspective of the modeler, what I do is that I look at this moment, if I am focused at this subject, and if I am giving this subject an opportunity to do what? Change decision. I go back a few moments in the simulation process and ask, hey simulation, do you have any other agents in the previous 2 seconds who accepted decision change? If they say yes, for me, that is a positive for this exit choice changing that I am analyzing right now, right? Because social influence is a factor and it's a positive factor in change. So If the agent has a better alternative, the likelihood of accepting the change is higher. If the person can see that alternative, the likelihood of accepting the change is higher. If the person have seen other people making a change within the past 1 or 2 seconds, then also the likelihood of accepting the change is higher. All that given, the person might accept the change or might reject the change, right? In every situation where we give this opportunity to the agent, in most of the cases they reject it, in some of the cases they accept it. I can do a simple calculations for you for a hypothetical case. This is the model. These are the parameters of the model. Where do the parameters come from? The parameters come from certain experiment that I did not go through the details of. Just go to the example, come on. This is my example, right? I'm talking about this agent, right? I want to calculate the probability that this agent accepts the opportunity to change. You might be asking, what is this inertia parameter? What is this inertia thing? Consider it a beta 0. This is the intercept of the model. This is a cap to make sure that decision changing is not happening too often, because it is not happening too often in the real world as well. In the model, this is your way of capping decision changes, so that the agents not all the time go from this way to that way, from that way to this way, which is not an accurate representation of reality. So a big fat negative number, which you see, a big fat negative number here, right, capping the acceptance of decision change. And you calculate this example. Okay, I got to the example finally. I haven't put it there. That's interesting. I thought I had. Where is this? Oh, here. There we go. Here we go. This is the example. The calculations is even simpler than exit choice. It's a binary logic, right? The alternatives are change or not change. It's a binary logic, very easy to calculate. These are the coefficients. This is the variable, and this is the utility of change. What is the utility of not change? Utility of not change would be 0, because when you're dealing with a binary logic, one utility is base, the other one is calculated relative to that in this particular example. And the probability of change in this case, 8%. So would the agent accept the change or not accept the change? Out of 100 situations like that you create, 8 of them would accept the change. The rest wouldn't accept the change. Some of these agents would. Even at the probability of 8%, yes, an agent might accept the change. Okay? A grateful agent would do that. Those ungrateful agents that would not accept the change, I'll collect them at the end of the simulation and do something. Now we go the end layer of the model, the pathfinding, etc., etc. The social force model. The social force model is not my creation. It's a very common model for the last layer of modeling. That's where you have already simulated strategic and tactical level decisions, and you want to know how the person would navigate themselves through the space to get to the point of interest. Then that's where the social force model does the job. But it gets its information from above, from tactical and strategic level. Every layer feeds the layer below it. And you have the model. And this is after 7 years of research and experimentation, just to get these numbers. I'm serious. The whole 200, 300 rounds of experimentations and all of that, just to get these numbers. But when they work together, they create a situation where you can relatively realistically simulate a crowd. And do not please get impressed by the visualization that I'm showing you, because similar to this, I can show you a visualization of a terrible model, and you wouldn't be able to tell that that's a terrible model. I wouldn't even be able to tell that that's a terrible model. So just because it's got a fancy visualization doesn't mean that it's a good model. It's just something that you have to do, because when you want to show it to people, they need to see the process. But strictly speaking, your model can just work behind the scene without any visualization. This is just for show off and no other purposes.
Hey, Milad.
Yes? No.
So this is not a normal situation, and
Oh.
everything is assuming that it's like evacuation, so people are kind of freaked out with some situation, so they really want to get out of the room, right? So that's not just a normal situation.
Yes. So some of these experiments that I have shown you, I haven't gone to all the details. Some have been undertaken under normal operations where pedestrians are told that there is no evacuations, there is no emergency, you do this task, okay? Only for the purpose of this talk, I limited everything to evacuations. But I do gather data from normal behavior of people. I do gather data from situations where I try to simulate a more urgent environment. Some aspects of people behavior really change. Some aspects actually do not really change. And exit choice, in fact, is one of those things that between emergency and normal, we do not see significant differences. But in terms of exit choice changing between normal and emergency, there is significant differences between the two layers. Thanks for the question. And once you have the model, do you remember the 20 parameters that I showed you? This question I face. I'll wrap it up in 2 minutes. This is the question that I had. Well, let's imagine that I didn't have 7 years, 8 years of doing this research, and I had very limited research funding, but I wanted a simulation model, right? So obviously, in that situation, I cannot do experiments for all layers of the model. I need to compromise some layers, but focus more on some other layers, right? If I am to do so, if I am to prioritize a certain aspect of model to invest in and perfect and make the parameters, get the parameters right, what would be that layer? What is it that has the most significant impact on the final outcome of the simulation? Is it how I specify exit choice? Is it how I specify reaction time? Is it how I specify exit choice changing? Is it how I specify local path finding, the last layer of the model? What do you think? I had my own intuition, and turned out my intuition was completely wrong. Okay, let me go back to the layers of the model. Here. Between these layers, what do you think has the most significant impact on the final outcome of your simulation output? I'll tell you something. Obviously, exit choice has the biggest manifestation in the simulation in that you can see the agent going either this way or that way. Plus, I had invested a lot of years in exit choice, and a lot of my contribution in that area had been picked up. So I thought the demand in the literature for that was also even bigger. So I thought maybe exit choice, maybe this is the most important layer. And remember when I was actually suspicious whether I need exit choice change layer in the first place? Turned out this layer of the model was the most important thing, in addition to local step taking. This is something that doesn't have a noticeable manifestation in the visual outcome of your model, but in the actual predictions, it has the biggest impact. This one has the biggest impact, and then after that, it's exit choice changing. And then we are talking about other things. So the final lesson from this part is that if your social force model that is designed to get your agent from A to B, and then to C to D, and all the way to the exit, that exit choice layer determines, if that is not fully calibrated, then the rest of the model doesn't matter how accurate it is. It's just you cannot achieve accuracy, right? And this is very hard to detect and spot by looking at the model, because I can misspecify this layer and simulate the situation and show it to you, and you believe it, and I believe it. And I can specify it perfectly, and then I simulate it again for you, and you wouldn't even see the difference. But exit choice and other things have manifestations in that you can see the reasonableness of people's exit choices. So it's this layer followed by exit choice changing layer. And that's disproportional to what the literature has offered. If you look at the literature of crowd dynamics, there are, I don't know, 20 papers about exit choice, half of them my contributions. But in terms of exit choice changing, there are only 2 papers, and those are only 2 of my papers, whereas, in fact, you should have invested in this instead of exit choice, right? Anyway, this is just something that you will learn at the end. There is no way to know this in the beginning. So if you look at the sensitivity of the model, it's very clear. Some parameters are more important than the others. Some parameters are more important than the others. Okay? This is descriptive crowd dynamics, meaning that our purpose was to model, simulate the crowd. Okay? But in the next lecture, I will talk about prescriptive crowd dynamics, how we can use these models to make crowds more efficient. Because just the mere fact that I can predict the crowds is not going to save anybody's lives, is not going to solve any situation. Just because I know the evacuation time of a stadium is 15 minutes, it's a good information to have, but it's not going to save anybody's lives, right? How can we utilize these things to make crowds more efficient? That's the next presentation. Thanks very much. What are we doing here?
Any questions? A lot of questions. Okay. Yes. Yeah. You first.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. This is very interesting for me about crowd safety or crowd simulation. I'm Rayhan, and I have a question about crowd safety during Hajj ritual in Mecca,
Yes.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Every year there are large crowd of pilgrims,
Yes.
and in this year, in temperature reaching up to 50 degrees Celsius,
Yes.
there are significant health and safety risks.
Yes.
And I want to ask about how can we use simulation and modeling to manage this risk,
Yes.
considering climate change?
Yes.
And yeah, how should we process if you want to experiment with this approach? Thank you.
Thank you. Rayhan, right?
Yeah, right.
Very good question, very timely. And I've written a media article about it on Hajj. If you look up my name and Hajj in news, you will see a media article that I wrote a couple of days ago, right before I came. So I've explained some of my views on that. So, as I showed you, crowd risks, intrinsic and extrinsics, right? At Hajj, traditionally, we have had intrinsic risks to crowd, where things happening due to crowd crushes. 4,000 or 5,000 people over the last 2 decades have died during crowd crushes. Now Saudi Arabia has learned from it and are mitigating risks of that nature. On the other side, climate extremes are getting worse, and now they are becoming an emerging form of risk to crowd safety. So you see across the world that, I have another media article about that, festivals, concerts, and these kind of mass gatherings are being canceled because of extreme weathers, including rain and heat waves, etc., etc. Except with Hajj, that's not an option. You cannot cancel, you cannot go indoors, you cannot relocate. It's in Mecca, it's in the time of the year that the lunar calendar indicates, right? You asked what simulation can help, it cannot. So that's one of the big points. When I told you that in the decade ago, everybody was focused on developing models, okay? And we have done enough modeling, right? For decades, we have been so hell-bent because it gets published nicely. You know, when you do modeling, it's just good for publication, and everybody wants to do that. Whereas all these other risks in terms of climate and terrorism, etc., we have left them, especially the climate thing, right? So that's why I will present to you a more comprehensive approach to crowd safety, where simulation is just one thing. Simulation is not the solution to everything. In terms of exposure to sun, everything, I do not think simulation would save people's lives. It's a matter of health emergency, and I have solutions for that. How you can monitor using bracelets, you know, individuals, you can monitor them, and you need to do educational campaigns to people about the risk of climate, okay? This goes into the social science of crowd, which is also something that I am involved in, and I try to give some aspects of that in the next lecture. Thank you for the question.
for your presentation. I think your experiment is very interesting. I'm very curious about how you find those very important factors when you doing the experiment.
The variables.
Yeah.
Remember when I said no modeler has good enough intuition to do the parameters? But modelers can have good enough intuitions to know the variables, okay? That's the job of the good modeler, okay? So as a good modeler, you think about the problem and you specify a model on the paper based on the literature, based on limited observations in the field. You go to the field, you look at things, you form an intuition, right? And you can have a rough model. Once you have the data, you can tweak that model a little bit as well, and I did that too. The original form of the model is slightly different. For example, that visibility, interaction with flow, etc., etc. You saw some complications that I did not explain. That did not exist initially in my model. Only once I had the data, I realized that that form is a better representation for the data. So initial intuition followed by the data.
Hey, Professor. Actually, my interest kind of peaked already in the crowd safety, so I'm kind of interested now. But for now, I'm interested with the agent aspect of the model. So I noticed that the variables or the agents react or make their decisions based on the environment. But how can the agents or play a part in the framework for interactions with other agents? Like, for example, platooning or me with my friends will have a different
You mean
decision.
social groups?
Yeah.
Oh, I had experiments with social groups.
Okay.
Oh, so this is something I could not explain.
Okay.
So I have experiments where instead of individually making decisions, you make decisions with a group of 3 people.
Yes.
And then I looked at the dynamics of how those decisions are made. Predominantly, they are made by a leader. So from the perspective of modeling, it's possible to let go of 2 of those agents, relieve them from decision making, and just let that one person make the decision, right? So that can be done. But you mentioned also platooning and interaction. The interactions are being taken into consideration at every aspect. For example, when the person is making decision, they look at the social influence and the behavior of others' interaction, the cue size, etc. When they change decision, they look at the behavior of other agents. When you're talking about the step taking, the social force model, that social force model takes into account the physical interactions and body contact of all other agents. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, last one.
Hello, Professor. I really appreciate the presentation. I want to ask a question about the generalizability of the model when we are facing with entities and mediums that has stairs, slope, and are generally three-dimensional, like cinema, theaters, metro subway stations. So I want to know how can these results be generalized to areas that are three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional?
Yes. So there are 2 aspects to generalizability. I did this exit choice model in one area that is similar to the building in Robert Nelson's building, right? Is it generalizable to another form of building? I have tested that. 2015, one set of experiments at one university with one group of people. 2017, in a different setup, just the same experiment in a different layout. In another university with another group of people, results, I could not get a chance to show it, really matching. So that's from one 2-dimensional to another 2-dimensional. So we are seeing over and over that these parameters repeat themselves. From a survey on the paper to an experiment that is similar to the survey on the paper, to an experiment that is not similar to the survey or the experiments on the paper, meaning that there is certain level of generalizability, right? So that is as far as exit choice goes, right? Now, if the environment is 2-dimensional, so you handle this room, and then outside this room is the stairs. Stairs is relatively easy. All I need to know is what is the speed of the agent on the stairs. There is not much element of complexity, and the experimentation is easy, and the literature offers it, what the speed of the people are. So because there is not much complexity in that, You can go to the literature, get some basic information, and just inject it to the data. When they are on the stairs, the movement can be handled two-dimensional, right? You know what I'm saying? That's your plane. That's your two-dimensional plane. Once they are on it. So basically, two-dimensional can work as long as you know what the speed of people on the stairs are going to be, going up and going down, right?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Actually, kids or students to stay awake. It must be the hang on everyone. But, that's it. 10 minutes break. 10 minutes break. Okay, and I have a second session.
Thank you. See you soon.